What if I told you that the United States nearly ceased to exist in 1814, defeated by the same empire from which it had liberated itself? That year, the world's greatest naval power, Great Britain, was about to deliver the final blow. After burning Washington and humiliating the young nation, London sent its best men, the same veterans who had defeated Napoleon in Europe, for one last and decisive invasion. The plan was simple and brutal. March from Canada, seize control of Lake Champlain, and cut America in two, isolating New England from the rest of the country. It would be the end of American independence as a viable political experiment. In the path of this invincible army stood only one line of defense, a lake of cold waters and an improvised fleet, built by farmers and carpenters with their own hands. Commanding this fragile hope was a man who planned to use a secret weapon that no war manual foresaw: the wind itself. This is the story of how a brilliant maneuver saved America from vanishing from the map. The context was brutal. The War of 1812 had turned into a disaster for the United States. What began as an attempt to force Britain to respect American maritime rights had become a fight for national survival. In August 1814, British troops had marched to Washington, burned the Capitol and the White House, and forced President James Madison to flee in haste. The smoldering Capitol was the perfect symbol of American fragility. Meanwhile, in the North, British General George Prevost assembled the largest army ever seen on the American continent up to that point. Over 10,000 veteran soldiers, many fresh from victorious campaigns in the Napoleonic Wars. These men had faced Napoleon's legions and won. To them, the American militia would be an appetizer before dinner. The British plan was strategically perfect. Lake Champlain served as a natural highway running north-south, connecting Canada to the heart of New York. Whoever controlled that lake controlled the Hudson-Champlain corridor, the main artery of trade and communication between New England and the rest of the country. If the British captured Albany and closed that route, New England states would be completely isolated. And there was another factor. Many New England Federalists were already openly talking secession, dissatisfied with the war. A successful British invasion could catalyze the collapse of the American Union just 38 years after its founding. London knew this and was ready to exploit every crack in the young country. But there was a problem in the path of this perfect plan: Lake Champlain itself. About 200 kilometers long, but narrow in many spots, the lake was a double-edged sword. To transport an army of 10,000 men with heavy artillery, supplies, and ammunition, Prevost needed absolute control of the waters. A purely land march would be suicidal, with poor roads and dense forests making it impossible to sustain the invasion logistically. This meant that before any advance, he needed to eliminate the small American fleet patrolling the lake. And that's where London made its first mistake, completely underestimating the man commanding that fleet. The scene was the makeshift shipyard in Vergennes, Vermont, where Thomas Macdonough was assembling his line of defense. The air mixed the smell of freshly cut pine, hot tar, and the tangible desperation of a cornered nation. Men who had never set foot on a warship hammered planks under moonlight, with bandaged hands and eyes fixed on the northern horizon. Women sewed sails on barn floors, using linen borrowed from their own homes. Boys ran with nails pried from local churches. The shipyard operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Adam and Noah Brown, two New York shipbuilders, had taken on an impossible challenge: build a full warship, the USS Saratoga, in just 40 days. To give you an idea of the madness of that deadline, an equivalent ship in England would take 6 months in a fully equipped royal shipyard. Across the lake, the British Empire prepared its fleet with the arrogance of those who knew themselves lords of the seas. Its flagship, the HMS Confiance, was a newly built floating fortress in the Île-aux-Noix shipyard. With 37 heavy guns and a crew of battle-hardened professional sailors from the seven seas, the Confiance alone had more firepower than the entire American fleet combined. Beside it, the Linnet, with 16 guns, and a flotilla of smaller gunboats, completed an armada that seemed invincible. In comparison, the American fleet was a collection of patched-up boats. The USS Saratoga had been built on an old merchant transport hull. The USS Eagle used wood from demolished settler houses. Its cannons were of different calibers, some so old they seemed museum relics, forcing gunners to memorize different loading procedures for each piece. To any serious military observer, the battle would be a foretold massacre. But they hadn't reckoned with Thomas Macdonough's mind. He wasn't a warrior of fiery speeches or heroic charges, but a quiet, methodical, and deeply religious man who saw battle as an engineering problem to be solved, and the solution he found would change the course of the war and American history. Thomas Macdonough wasn't born to be America's savior. Born in Delaware in 1783, son of a Revolutionary War doctor, he joined the Navy at 16, when the American Navy was practically non-existent. He spent years serving under the legendary Stephen Decatur in the wars against Barbary pirates, where he learned that courage without intelligence was just another word for wasting lives. At 30, when he received command of the Lake Champlain squadron, many veteran officers considered it a forgotten post, a position without glory in a secondary theater of war. They were completely wrong. Macdonough saw that lake not as exile, but as a three-dimensional chessboard where winds, currents, water depth, and shoreline geography created a tactical equation few understood. He spent months studying every inch of that lake, talking to local fishermen about wind patterns, testing depths, mapping currents. While his officers complained of boredom, he was mentally building the battle that hadn't yet begun. Macdonough's genius lay in his ability to see beyond the obvious. The naval doctrine of the era dictated that ships position in line, exchange fire until one side ran out of functional guns, and the winner determined by who had more artillery and better aim. It was simple math. The British had more guns, better guns, and more experienced gunners. In that traditional equation, American defeat was guaranteed. But Macdonough noticed something the British manuals didn't foresee. In the narrow of Lake Champlain, near Plattsburgh Bay, the winds were treacherous and unpredictable due to the surrounding mountains. A ship could be becalmed in still waters, while another, just meters away, caught a breeze. And that's when he developed his secret weapon, literally hidden beneath the water's surface. The system Macdonough created was technically called spring lines and kedge anchors, but it was really an impossible naval choreography. It worked like this. Each of his main ships would have not one, but multiple anchors dropped at carefully calculated angles. From bow and stern, special cables called springs would be tied to these anchors. During battle, when the guns on one side of the ship were destroyed or out of ammunition, the crew could, using a system of pulleys and brute force, pull the cables in coordinated fashion. This would pivot the ship 180 degrees on its own axis, without needing wind, without maneuvering, instantly presenting a completely fresh side with all intact and loaded guns. To the enemy, it would be like fighting a ship that magically regenerated mid-battle. Installing this system was surgical precision done in absolute secrecy. Divers descended into the lake's icy waters to position the anchors. Special cables, stronger than standard, were fabricated locally. Every sailor was exhaustively trained in his specific role during the pivot maneuver. Macdonough personally supervised every test, timing how long it took to complete the full rotation. In secret nighttime drills, he reduced the time to under 15 minutes. The secret was absolute. Not even the British, nor some of his own officers, fully understood what was being prepared. To outside eyes, it looked like mere overcaution, extra anchors to keep ships stable during combat. But Macdonough's strategy had more than engineering. He chose the battlefield with a chess master's precision in positioning his pieces. Instead of awaiting the British fleet in open waters, where larger enemy ships would have maneuvering advantage, he positioned his fleet in Plattsburgh Bay, in a narrow formed by a peninsula and an island. There, space was limited, neutralizing British numerical superiority. Prevailing northerly winds would force the British to advance directly into the American line, without possibility of complex lateral maneuvers. And most importantly, by anchoring his ships, Macdonough eliminated his improvised fleet's greatest disadvantage, the lack of experienced sailors in sail maneuvers. His men wouldn't need to navigate. They'd only need to fire, reload, and, at the right moment, execute the impossible, pivot a ship without wind. On the morning of September 11, 1814, as morning mist still covered the lake, Macdonough made his final inspection. He personally checked every anchor, tested every cable, spoke briefly with every ship commander. He made no grandiloquent speech to the crew. Instead, he knelt on the Saratoga's deck and, in a low voice for God alone to hear, offered a simple, direct prayer. Lord, it is your wind that blows today. Guide us through this storm. It was the prayer of an engineer, not a preacher. Specific, functional, humble. When he rose, the mist was beginning to lift, and on the northern horizon, the white sails of the British fleet appeared, bellied by favorable wind, advancing with the confidence of those who had never lost. What none of them knew was that they were sailing into one of the brightest tactical traps in naval history. The battle was about to begin, and with it, the fate of a nation would be decided in the next 3 hours. At 8 a.m., the British fleet completed its attack formation. Captain George Downey, commander of the HMS Confiance, observed the American line through his spyglass with a mix of disdain and impatience. A veteran of countless naval battles, including actions against the French fleet, Downey saw this operation as a necessary formality before the triumphant march to Albany. His officers shared the confidence. General Prevost himself, observing from the hills with his 10,000-man army, expected the naval battle to last, at most, an hour. Some British officers even placed bets on how long the Americans would hold out before striking their colors. The arrogance was palpable. The HMS Confiance fired a warning shot that echoed through the Adirondack Mountains, a traditional signal for the enemy to surrender without fight. Macdonough's response was silent but eloquent. He personally sighted one of the Saratoga's 24-pounders, adjusted the elevation with millimeter precision, and pulled the lanyard. The projectile crossed the distance and struck the Confiance's hull just above the waterline, opening the first hole in the floating fortress. The battle had officially begun. Hell materialized on Champlain's waters. Both fleets opened fire with everything they had. The noise was deafening, a continuous thunder that made the mountains reverberate. Gunpowder smoke quickly covered the lake like toxic fog, reducing visibility to mere meters. Gunners worked like automatons, following an ear-splitting routine. Swab the barrel, insert the powder charge, ram the cannonball, compress with the rammer, prick the powder bag through the touch hole, place the quill, aim, and fire. Each cycle took about 90 seconds when executed by an experienced crew. The American crews, less trained, took 2 minutes or more. But what they lacked in speed, they made up for in desperate determination. Cannonballs created water columns when they missed, and devastating explosions of splintered wood when they hit. A single accurate shot could kill or maim a dozen men instantly. The Saratoga's deck quickly became a slaughterhouse. Wood splinters, as deadly as machine gun fire, flew in all directions. Men screamed for surgeons while clutching severed limbs. Blood made the deck slippery, forcing sailors to spread sand for traction. It was amid this chaos that the moment defining Macdonough's leadership occurred. He was beside one of his lieutenants, giving orders on fire adjustment, when a British cannonball struck a nearby gun. The impact turned the cannon into a massive fragmentation bomb. The lieutenant was decapitated instantly, and the man's blood, bones, and viscera were hurled over Macdonough, completely covering his blue uniform. The crew around froze, horrified. For a brief second, time seemed to stop. It was the kind of moment that could break the morale of exhausted, terrified men. Macdonough, without hesitating a single second, simply wiped the blood from his face with his sleeve, looked directly at the paralyzed men, and said in a calm voice, "Continue at your stations. He's with God now. We still have work to do." Then, as if nothing had happened, he returned to coordinating the gunfire. That act of supernatural coolness broke the panic. The men, inspired by their commander's impossible serenity, returned to the guns with renewed fury. For 2 hours, the exchange of fire was absolutely brutal. The ships were so close that sharpshooters on both sides used muskets to fire on enemy decks, targeting officers and gunners. Some vessels got so near that sailors hurled grappling hooks, trying to pull enemy ships into hand-to-hand combat. The USS Eagle, the second-largest American ship, had its sails shredded and lost control, forced to reposition. The HMS Linnet concentrated devastating fire on the Saratoga, puncturing its hull in multiple spots. Water began entering the hold. The Saratoga's guns facing the Confiance were systematically destroyed, one by one. Of the 14 artillery pieces on that flank, only 3 still functioned by 11 a.m. The crew was exhausted, covered in blood and soot, with ears bleeding from the deafening noise. To any observer, the Saratoga was minutes from surrender. Across the way, the British believed victory was within reach. The HMS Confiance had taken damage, yes, but its structure was still solid. Captain Downey had been killed by a splinter early in the battle, but his first lieutenant had assumed command without losing momentum. They could clearly see the American guns silencing, one by one. Just a few more shots, and the enemy flagship would be forced to strike its colors. It was a matter of minutes. It was exactly in this moment of apparent defeat that Macdonough gave the signal that would transform the battle. He looked at his boatswain and simply nodded. There was no dramatic speech, no battle cry, just a silent nod. And below deck, sailors began executing the choreography they had rehearsed hundreds of times. They released the forward anchors and began pulling the aft cables with coordinated force. At first, nothing seemed to happen. Then, slowly and majestically, the impossible began to materialize before the incredulous eyes of the British. The Saratoga began to pivot. The HMS Confiance was less than 100 meters from the Saratoga when its officers realized something was wrong. The American ship, which should have been paralyzed and on the verge of surrender, began to move in a way that defied all laws of naval navigation. There was no strong wind for maneuvers. The Saratoga's sails were partially destroyed, and yet the ship was pivoting on its own axis, slow but inexorable, as if an invisible hand were turning it. On the Confiance deck, confusion quickly turned to alarm. What was happening was technically impossible. A warship of that size couldn't execute a full rotation without wind, without oars, without any apparent motive force. And yet it was happening before their eyes. The battered side of the Saratoga, with its silenced guns and punctured hull, slowly vanished from view. And in its place, emerging from the smoke like a sea monster reborn, appeared the American ship's starboard flank, completely intact, with a full row of loaded and ready guns. The Confiance crew's reaction was one of absolute panic. Officers shouted contradictory orders. Some British gunners, paralyzed by surprise, simply stopped working, staring at the impossible phenomenon. Others desperately tried to reload their guns to face this new threat, but the Saratoga's rotation was faster. Before they could adequately prepare, a devastating broadside of 14 24-pounders struck the Confiance full-on. The range was so short that the projectiles punched completely through the British ship's hull, entering one side and exiting the other, creating barrel-sized holes. The Confiance deck exploded into chaos. Guns were torn from their mounts. Wood splinters the size of spears flew in all directions. Masts cracked and sails collapsed. In seconds, the proud British flagship was transformed from predator to prey. The crew, which moments before had celebrated imminent victory, now fought only to survive. But Macdonough's true masterstroke wasn't just pivoting one ship. It was having foreseen the entire battle sequence, like a chess player anticipating future moves. As the Saratoga executed its impossible rotation, the USS Eagle, which had been forced to reposition earlier, seized the moment of British confusion to also perform a pivot using secondary anchors. Suddenly, the British faced not one, but two American ships with fresh artillery. The HMS Linnet, which had punished the Americans severely during the first 2 hours of battle, now found itself squeezed between the crossfire of the Saratoga and the Eagle. Its crew desperately tried to maneuver to escape the trap, but the wind, that same wind that had brought the British so confidently into the bay, now conspired against them. They were trapped, unable to retreat or advance effectively. What followed was a complete reversal of the battle's dynamics. In the first 120 minutes, the British had dominated utterly, systematically pounding the American fleet. But in the next 45 minutes, it was the Americans who dictated terms. The Confiance, with its hull punctured in dozens of places, began taking on water rapidly. Its decks were covered in dead and wounded. Of its original 37 guns, fewer than 10 still functioned. The officer who had assumed command after Captain Downey's death was himself gravely wounded. The crew, largely composed of impressed sailors with no personal loyalty to the cause, began abandoning their posts. Some simply lay on the deck, refusing to continue. Others jumped into the water, preferring to risk drowning rather than face more bombardment. At 11:45 a.m., with the ship sinking slowly and no longer able to fight, the British flag on the HMS Confiance was struck. The flagship, the centerpiece of the entire British invasion strategy, had surrendered. The HMS Linnet resisted heroically for a few more minutes, but the situation was untenable. Surrounded by multiple American ships, with its commander wounded and over half its crew out of action, continued resistance was simply suicide. At 11:52 a.m., its flag came down too. The smaller gunboats tried to flee, but several ran aground on the lake's shallow margins or were captured. In less than 3 hours of combat, the British fleet had been completely annihilated. Of the 16 vessels that entered the battle under the British flag, 11 were captured, 4 destroyed, and only 1 escaped. On the American side, no ship was lost. It wasn't a victory, it was an absolute and devastating triumph. On the surrounding hills of Plattsburgh, General George Prevost and his 10,000 veteran soldiers watched in horror as their fleet was destroyed. They had marched hundreds of kilometers, endured the impossible logistics of northern forests, all based on the premise that lake control was assured. And in a few hours, that premise had disintegrated completely. Prevost's reaction was immediate and revealing. Without the fleet, his army was completely vulnerable. Its supply lines were cut. If he advanced by land, he would be isolated and likely surrounded by American militias now converging on the area, emboldened by the naval victory. Retreat was the only rational option. That same night, to the astonishment and humiliation of his officers,